In what season are we? In what season are we? The answer, all great ideas, the answer depends on who you talk to. If you talk to a doctor, the answer might be it's flu season, or COVID, or RSV. If you talk to an accountant, they're going to say it's tax season, right? If you ask a person in New Orleans right now, they may say Mardi Gras party season. Mardi Gras Tuesday, by the way. If you talk to a sports person, they may say it's college basketball season, or NASCAR, or NHL, or NBA, whichever sports you watch. Or if you're the parent of a high school student, there might be high school sports happening right now, or perhaps music or chorus happening. What if you asked a group of pastors? What if you asked a group of pastors? They will look at their church calendar and they will say, well, this is the season after the Epiphany. And today is the last Sunday of that season. Today is the last Sunday before the season of Lent begins with Ash Wednesday, which happens to be this week. But today is Transfiguration Sunday. How many of you woke up this morning and said, I can't wait for worship today, it's Transfiguration Sunday? You may have said, I can't wait for worship today. Bless you if you did. But Transfiguration likely didn't figure into your plans for today unless you maybe read the Pulpit View in the newsletter from Friday. Transfiguration is a word that children struggle to say, adults struggle to understand, and a worship service most pastors don't particularly look forward to preaching. Because it just seems weird to all of us. We want more details. We want answers. We want the how did this happen. We don't get that. And here we are, Transfiguration Sunday. The story of the Transfiguration, as Lisa just read, is contained in what's called the Synoptic Gospels, the three Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. It's not included in John. John typically does his own thing most of the time. But I especially like the Luke story because it includes a few more details that Matthew and Mark do not have. Now, let's talk about what they do have in common first. Matthew, Mark, and Luke all include Jesus taking Peter, James, and John with him to the mountaintop, as we see in Luke verse 28. Now, about 8 days after these sayings, Jesus took with him Peter and James and John and went up the mountain to pray. What happened to the others? We don't know. Were they even invited? Maybe Jesus sent them on a task or a mission. Y'all go do this while we're going to be up here praying. But maybe they were busy doing something else. Jesus, that's okay. We've been really busy. I just need a break. We don't know. But I bet that once they heard what happened, they regretted not being there. Matthew, Mark, and Luke also include Jesus transfigured before their eyes. Matthew and Matthew and Mark actually say that Jesus was transfigured. They use that word. In Luke, it is implied. Luke 9:29. And while he was praying, the appearance of his face changed, and his clothes became dazzling white. That's the part we want explained. And Matthew and Mark and Luke all include Moses and Elijah appearing and talking with Jesus. Suddenly, they saw two men, Moses and Elijah, talking to him. How did they know it was Moses and Elijah? Did Moses have some stone tablets he was holding? How did they know it was Elijah? And then in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Peter offers to build a dwelling place for Jesus, Moses, and Elijah. Luke 9:33, just as they were leaving him, Peter said to Jesus, "Master, it is good for us to be here. Let us make 3 dwellings, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." Peter not knowing what he was saying. Finally, in all 3, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, a cloud overshadows them, and a voice speaks to them. Luke 9, while he was saying this, a cloud came and overshadowed them, and they were terrified as they entered the cloud. Then from the cloud came a voice that said, "This is my son, my beloved," or "This is my son, my chosen," as it has in your bulletin. Listen to him. Does that sound familiar? Remember Jesus' baptism that we talked about several weeks ago when very similar words were spoken over him? This is my beloved. This is my son with whom I am well pleased. Here again in this story, hearkening back to Jesus' baptism, is a voice that claims and names Jesus for who he is. So that's the basics of the Transfiguration story. That's what they all have in common. Understand it all? Probably not. Me neither. But for Luke, what I like it isn't quite the whole story. See, Luke includes some extra details not found in Matthew and Mark. First, Luke gives us some details about that conversation between Jesus, Moses, and Elijah. Luke 9, suddenly they saw 2 men, Moses and Elijah, talking to him. They appeared in glory and were speaking of his departure, of his exodus, which he was about to accomplish at Jerusalem. Matthew and Mark don't mention at all what they were discussing, but Luke tells us that they were speaking of Jesus' departure, Jesus' exodus. The Greek word used here and translated either as departure or exodus is exodos. Exodos. That sounds familiar. Like our word exodus, as in the book of the Bible that talks about the Israelites' escape from Egypt. I would have loved more information about that conversation that they were having. Moses was part of saving God's people from slavery. And Elijah spent a lifetime reminding people about that story. And Jesus is saying, that's all well and good, guys. That's great. Did a fabulous job. But here is how God is going to save God's people now. Reverend Bradley Schlemming points out in a commentary on Luke, the Greek word Exodus carries multiple meanings. First, it recalls the first Exodus when God sent Moses to the Israelites to deliver them from bondage in Egypt. Second, Exodus is a euphemism for death, anticipating the means by which the Messiah will save God's people in this time. And third, Jesus will indeed depart after his resurrection by way of the ascension into glory. And then he says, in these three messages taken together, Jesus' departure represents a salvific mission in which God's Messiah will suffer and die before he is raised and vindicated into glory. This follows exactly Jesus' prediction in response to Peter's correct identification of him as God's Messiah. Let's back up a little bit. Let's unpack that a little bit. Back up into chapter 9, because the verses that come before a passage and after a passage often give us insight into its meaning. In Luke 9:18 through 20, Jesus asked the disciples, "Who do the crowds say that I am?" And they respond, "John the Baptist, Elijah, some other ancient prophet." And then Jesus says, "But who do you say that I am?" And it is here that Peter replies, impetuous, always ready to speak up, Peter. And he replies, "You are the Messiah, the Son of God." Then Jesus says in response to that, "The Son of Man must undergo great suffering and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and scribes, and be killed, and on the third day be raised again." This is the Exodus. The way that the Messiah, as professed by Peter, will save God's people from slavery to sin and death. Jesus saved God's people from slavery to sin and death. And then, Jesus doesn't let it be there. Jesus talks about our part in this redemption, in this Exodus. Luke 9:21, "Then he said to them, if any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross daily and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake will save it. What does it profit them if they gain the whole world but lose or forfeit themselves?" We are called to be involved in this redemption, to share in every day those acts of grace and mercy and forgiveness. There's a lot that's been preached about those words, take up your cross. And somehow, somebody has gotten an idea that that means that we have great suffering, and the more suffering you have, the better you are. But I offer to you that taking up our cross might just mean forgiveness, might just mean offering grace, might just mean extending God's love to all people, as Jesus did. We are part of the Exodus, and in that, we share in the glory of Jesus. The Luke Transfiguration account, unlike the accounts in Matthew and Mark, talk about glory. Luke 9:30 through 32. Suddenly they saw two men, Moses and Elijah, talking to him. They appeared in glory and were speaking of his departure, which he was about to accomplish at Jerusalem. Now, Peter and his companions were weighed down with sleep. And when they became awake, they saw his glory and the two men who stood with him. The glory of Jesus as seen in the Transfiguration. After Peter's confession of Jesus as the Messiah, after Jesus described what's going to happen to him in Jerusalem when they come down off this mountain, and after Jesus talks about us being involved in taking up our own cross daily, after all that, the glory of God is revealed. Now, glory is a word that we might think we don't talk much about in our churchy circles. How many of you say to your friends, "Church was great this week. I really experienced the glory of God"? I had a great encounter with this person. The glory of God was present in our conversation. It seems like such a churchy word. But we do say, don't we, at the end of the Lord's Prayer, "For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory forever. Amen." And perhaps you might remember a song about glory, a song we call the Gloria Patri. Turn in your hymnals right now. Turn in your hymnals right now. That doesn't give me great confidence that you're paying attention, I'm just saying. Page 70. Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Ghost, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen. Many of you didn't even need your hymnals. How many people remember singing that song growing up? Glory be to the Father, to the Son, and to the Holy Ghost. Or do you remember a song? Maybe you learned it. I did as a kid at camp or Sunday school or whatever. Rise and shine and give God the glory, glory, glory. Fortunately, I'm not going to sing that for you. But rise and shine and give God the glory. We do mention glory. And this transfiguration story is full of God's glory, of God's dazzling, blinding light. Now, glory, as translated here in Luke, is from the Greek word doxa. Glory, doxa, means, according to the New Interpreter's Dictionary, it means magnificent, excellence, dignity, brightness, praise, splendor. So let's go back right now to Luke's words about glory, about magnificence, about excellence, about splendor, about bright lights. First, perhaps the glory of Jesus in this transfiguration story is evident in the presence of Moses and Elijah. See, if Moses represents the law, and Elijah represents the prophets, then perhaps Jesus standing with Moses and Elijah in glory signifies Jesus fulfilling the law and fulfilling the words of the prophets. Jesus said, I have not come to abolish the law, I have come to fulfill it. And we know that throughout the prophets, there was prophecy about this Messiah. In the life, death, and resurrection, and the redeeming fulfillment of the prophet's words, there is glory. God's glory is seen when all of God's intentions and dreams for humanity are fulfilled. Let me say that again. God's glory is seen when all of God's intentions and dreams for humanity are fulfilled. As if all of heaven and earth converged upon that mountain. And on that mountain, Peter, James, and John experienced that glory. Now, that is all well and good. Pastor, it's a great story. But what might that mean for us in seeing the glory of God today? What might this transfiguration story tell us about the glory of God today in our lives? I don't know about you, but I've never experienced Jesus before me with Moses and Elijah in a dazzling, brilliant, blinding light. Have you? It's okay if you have. I want to hear about it if you have. But I can tell you this, you have experienced the glory of God. You have experienced thin places. I offer to you this morning that what Peter and James and John experienced in the glory of God in the transfiguration was a thin place. Perhaps you've heard that term before, a thin place. Thin place was a term that was first used by Celtic Christians many centuries ago to describe the place where heaven and earth meet. The saying goes, heaven and earth are only 3 feet apart, but in the thin places that distance is even smaller. In the thin places is a space where heaven and earth meet. You may have experienced those moments, those times when heaven and earth meet. Perhaps you've experienced it in nature, when you were left speechless and in awe. Perhaps you've experienced it in holding a newborn baby. Perhaps you've experienced a thin place standing beside the bed of a person transitioning out of this life, making their exodus into glory. Perhaps you've experienced it gathering around this table of grace. That is a thin place every time we celebrate Holy Communion. Perhaps you've experienced it with a baptismal font in welcoming a new child into the presence of God. Perhaps you've experienced it in a moment when you are standing up against injustice. God's intentions for humanity come together. Heaven and earth meet. Perhaps you've experienced it being a voice for the voiceless. Perhaps you've experienced it when somebody extends you forgiveness that you know you don't deserve. Or when you share grace so extravagantly, you're not even sure why you did that. That, my friends, is a thin place. Any space where the presence of God is felt with the very fiber of your being. moments where you can visibly see and feel heaven and earth meet in one spectacular moment. The atmosphere, as Jenny Bridgman says, the atmosphere of a thin place is difficult to describe and overwhelming to experience. Have you experienced a thin place? The story of a rabbi, she says, standing on a mountaintop with his friends and in a single moment being transformed by brilliant light is a thin place story. The Transfiguration is a thin place story, and it's a story for all of us on the experience of thin places. Luke 9, now Peter and his companions were weighed down with sleep, but when they awoke, they saw his glory and the two men who stood with them. When they awoke, we experience or can experience the glory of God happen all around us when we pay attention. When we stay awake, when we actively share God's love and grace and forgiveness and compassion, when we move and come down off that mountain. See, we like to be comfortable, don't we? We come to church, we worship, and then we leave this space and we go back to work. Are you still experiencing the glory of God by Tuesday morning? Sometimes I'm not by Monday at noon. See, Peter wanted to stay there. He was comfortable there. And he had a plan. Luke 9:33, Master, it's good for us to be here. It's good for us to be here, friends. Let us make 3 dwellings, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. Let's build some dwelling places, and we can all just hang out together here. Peter wanted to bask in the glory. We get that. But had he stayed there, had they stayed in those dwellings, the mission of Jesus, the redemption of the cross and the glory of the resurrection might have been lost for humanity. Glory comes, friends, when we come down off the mountain. Glory comes when we journey beyond our feel-good experiences of meeting the fullness of Jesus. Jan Richardson wrote a book of blessings for the seasons. Her book is titled Circle of Grace, a book of blessings for the seasons. And she uses that word as seasons of life, seasons in the church. Here's a transfiguration blessing from her book, a blessing for you on this day. In this season, wherever you find yourself and however you are experiencing the glory of God. Hold out your hands, palms up, to receive this blessing. You don't even have to raise them high. I'm not asking you to raise them high. Just hold out your hands to receive this blessing. That when glory comes, we will open our eyes to see it. That when glory shows up, we will let ourselves be overcome not by fear, but by the love it bears. That when glory shines, we will bring it back with us all the way, all the way, all the way down. Here we go, friends. Down the mountain and into Lent. Making our way towards resurrection glory. So let's journey together. It begins on this Wednesday. So this week, I'll see you at the foot of the mountain in this